You won't believe what HOA Karen did the moment she saw my wife step out of our lake cabin. She literally gasped, pulled out her phone, and said in the loudest, most dramatic voice, "You're not allowed to carry a weapon here." My wife, calm as ever, just looked at her and smiled like she was watching a squirrel yell at a mountain lion. We had just arrived that morning for a peaceful weekend getaway at the lake cabin we'd saved up for over 2 years. The lake was quiet, the trees were swaying gently in the breeze, and birds chirped like a peaceful soundtrack in the background. It was perfect, until Karen showed up. Now let me paint the picture. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the self-declared queen of the HOA, even though our cabin wasn't part of their association. Our property sat just outside the border of the HOA zone, which gave us full independence. But that never stopped her from poking around. She'd made herself a one-woman patrol unit, always watching, always judging, always looking for a rule to enforce, even when it wasn't her rule to begin with. That day, my wife had gone on a short trail walk behind the cabin, something she loved doing after long work weeks. She wore hiking boots, a hat, sunglasses, and yes, her sidearm. It was a small pistol holstered at her waist, which she always carried off-duty. See, what Karen didn't know, and what made this entire situation so ridiculous, was that my wife wasn't some random visitor or dangerous woman, as Karen would later claim. My wife was a decorated federal agent with over 15 years of service. She had clearance and legal right to carry her firearm on or off duty, especially in rural, private areas like our cabin retreat. But Karen didn't care about that. The moment she saw the gun, she reacted like she'd just witnessed a bank robbery. She whipped out her phone and began filming, narrating as if she were a reporter. "This woman is brandishing a firearm in a family neighborhood. I am calling the HOA and the sheriff," she yelled, pacing around like she was doing the community a favor. We thought it was funny at first. I even chuckled and said, "Babe, she's going full CSI on you." But Karen wasn't kidding. She was serious. She stormed off like she was off to war, and not 5 minutes later, I heard her yelling into the phone behind some bushes near our driveway. She was calling someone, whether it was the HOA, 911, or her cat, I don't know, but she kept repeating the word gun like she was casting a curse. We shrugged it off. We thought it would blow over once someone reminded her that we weren't under HOA jurisdiction and that my wife was legally carrying her sidearm. But oh no, Karen doesn't back down. She went home, stewed in her paranoia for a few days, and then decided she was going to take it to the next level. 3 days after we returned from the cabin, we were served legal papers at our main residence. Karen had actually filed a civil complaint against my wife. She accused her of public intimidation, threatening behavior, and unauthorized display of a weapon in a peaceful community. I couldn't believe what I was reading. It was like a script for a bad drama series. She described my wife as militant-looking, claimed children were crying, and neighbors were hiding in their homes. None of that ever happened. There were no witnesses. No kids. No neighbors even present that day, except Karen hiding behind her shrub. I was fuming, ready to countersue for defamation and harassment. But my wife, as always, was calm and cool. She read through the papers, looked at me, and said with a little grin, "Let her go ahead. This is going to be fun." That's when I knew, my wife had a plan. She wasn't going to fight fire with fire. She was going to show this woman exactly why you don't go picking fights when you don't know who you're dealing with. Karen had no idea that the very woman she was trying to sue was one of the most respected agents in her field. And worse for her, my wife had the documentation, the credentials, and the legal backing to shut this down instantly. But instead of ending it with a phone call or a letter from her agency, she decided to let it play out. She said, "Sometimes people like her need to be humiliated publicly. That's the only thing that gets through to them." And I couldn't agree more. The moment Karen filed that lawsuit, she turned what could have been a private conversation into a public spectacle. And she thought she was going to win. She thought she was going to march into court, throw around her fake rules, and have the judge bow to her exaggerated complaints. But what she didn't realize was that she was about to get the biggest courtroom shock of her life. I'll never forget how confident she looked walking into that courthouse, folder in hand, dressed like she was headed to a job interview. She thought she had us. She thought she was the hero in this story. But what happened next would flip the entire script, and it all started with a single sentence from the judge. Karen's lawsuit was one of the most dramatic, exaggerated, and ridiculous pieces of fiction I've ever seen in my life. The way she told it, you'd think my wife had stepped out of a burning building with a rocket launcher strapped to her back. The complaint described her as aggressive, militant, and deliberately provoking fear in a family-friendly area. She even wrote that children were seen running indoors, crying, and that elderly residents were visibly shaken. The truth? There were no children. There were no elderly residents present. It was just her. Just Karen, standing behind a bush, shaking like she had personally uncovered a terrorist cell. But in her mind, she had found a threat. And she was going to save the neighborhood from it, no matter how far she had to stretch the truth. She included 3 blurry photos in the complaint. One of my wife's back as she walked toward the cabin, one of her hand resting near her holster, and one picture of the cabin with the words, "Gun Zone," scribbled across it in red marker. I kid you not. She had drawn arrows and circled things like she was preparing an FBI file herself. The entire thing would have been laughable if it weren't for the fact that it was an actual court filing, with a case number and everything. Now, we weren't worried legally. My wife knew the law better than most people in that courtroom, including Karen's own lawyer, apparently. But we were curious to see how far Karen would take this. And more importantly, my wife wanted everything to play out in public. She wasn't interested in just dismissing the case quietly. She wanted it all on record, so that the next time Karen tried to bully someone, she'd be reminded of the courtroom disaster she brought on herself. Still, even with all that, Karen's boldness amazed me. She even went to the local HOA Facebook group, writing a vague but clearly targeted post that said, "A dangerous incident occurred this week involving an outsider and a deadly weapon. Thankfully, our legal system will take care of it. Safety first." And of course, people started speculating. A few supportive neighbors messaged us privately, saying they suspected she was talking about my wife and offering to write character references. Others were more cautious, not sure what the real story was yet. Karen was clearly building a little bubble of fear around her made-up incident. But that bubble was about to burst. The week before the hearing, Karen's confidence seemed to grow. She started walking around the neighborhood more proudly, greeting people like she was the sheriff of the Wild West. She printed off the court papers and showed them to a few neighbors like a trophy, saying, "I just want to make sure we're all safe here." One neighbor told us she even hinted at running for HOA president next year. I'll admit, watching her build herself up like that made the anticipation for the court date even sweeter. My wife stayed mostly quiet the whole time. She didn't argue, she didn't explain anything to the neighbors, and she didn't get defensive. She just kept a folder ready with all her credentials, her federal clearances, the laws regarding open carry in private rural properties, and her official exemption as a federal agent under multiple security policies. The woman was prepared. And she wasn't preparing to just defend herself, she was ready to dismantle Karen's entire argument in one calm, professional move. Then came the big day. We arrived early at the courthouse, dressed neat and simple. Karen showed up a few minutes later, wearing a bright red blazer like she was about to accept an award. She was holding a stack of papers, muttering to herself, pacing back and forth with her lawyer trailing behind. The lawyer looked uncomfortable. Probably because he'd finally realized what kind of client he was representing. I heard him whisper, "Let's just keep it professional, Karen. Stick to the facts." Karen didn't hear him. She was too busy rehearsing her speech in her head, her eyes flicking toward us like she was already imagining her victory parade. My wife just sat there, calm and collected, her badge and federal ID tucked neatly in her folder. When the judge finally entered and called the case, everything went quiet. Karen sprang up like a game show contestant and immediately launched into her monologue. Your Honor, I stand here not only for myself, but for the entire community. We live in fear because of this woman's reckless display of a firearm. She was visibly armed, threatening, and showed no respect for the families who reside near that lake. The judge raised an eyebrow and interrupted, were there any witnesses? Karen froze for a second, then replied, no, but I was there, and I have photos. She handed over the blurry pictures. The judge squinted at them, sighed, and asked if the defendant would like to respond. That's when my wife stood up, walked confidently to the center of the courtroom, and placed her folder on the bench. She introduced herself, explained her profession and role, then calmly stated, Your Honor, I am a federal agent with clearance to carry a firearm on and off duty, including in rural areas and private property. I was not on HOA property. I was not engaging with any residents. I was simply walking back to my cabin after a trail hike. I have no history of violence or threats, and I was not approached by this woman until after I had already returned to my porch. The judge flipped through her documents, then looked at Karen and asked, Did you know she was a federal agent? Karen replied, No, she didn't say anything. My wife answered, I wasn't obligated to. She didn't ask. The courtroom chuckled. The judge shook his head and leaned back in his chair. Ms. Karen, you filed a formal legal complaint accusing a licensed federal agent of brandishing a weapon, with no witnesses, no law violations, and based solely on your discomfort? Karen stammered, It's about community safety. The judge glanced down, closed the folder, and said in the most dry, blunt tone, Case dismissed. And frankly, Ms. Karen, this borders on harassment. I suggest you not weaponize the court system because you're uncomfortable with things you don't understand. Karen stood frozen, mouth open, her lawyer whispering something urgently in her ear. But the damage was done. Her fantasy courtroom win had just collapsed in seconds. The silence in the courtroom after the judge dismissed the case was deafening. You could practically hear Karen's fantasy crumble. Her shoulders, once held high with self-righteous confidence, slumped as if the weight of her own embarrassment had finally caught up with her. The stack of papers she had waved around like a sword now looked like nothing more than a pile of pointless drama. Her lawyer leaned in and whispered something urgently again, probably suggesting she stop before digging the hole any deeper. But Karen, being Karen, couldn't leave it alone. She straightened up and stammered, But Your Honor, she still had a gun, around families. The judge didn't even raise his head this time. He simply said, Ms. Karen, I've already ruled. Please sit down or step out. That was it. Karen's case, her moment, her big plan to save the community, had ended not with applause, but with a quiet humiliation. As we exited the courtroom, a few people in the hall, likely folks from the HOA or others who had followed the story, nodded toward us. One woman even gave my wife a little thumbs up and whispered, Good for you. Karen walked past them like a ghost, her eyes locked forward, pretending she didn't hear the subtle snickers or feel the judgment crawling up her back. And then came the real fallout. See, the thing about dragging someone to court without cause, especially someone with the law clearly on their side, is that you don't just lose the case. You lose credibility. Karen returned to the neighborhood thinking people would praise her for taking action. But word had already spread faster than wildfire. Someone who sat in the back of the courtroom posted the judge's comments anonymously on the HOA forum. The line, weaponizing the court system, hit hard. People started asking questions. Why had Karen gone that far? Why didn't she just speak to my wife like a normal person? Why did she lie about children being present? Within 24 hours, that vague post Karen had originally made on Facebook, claiming a dangerous individual had been dealt with, was flooded with comments. Some were sarcastic, "Glad the courtroom is safe again, Karen." Others were more serious, "You tried to sue a federal agent for walking to her cabin?" By the next day, the HOA board issued a statement. It didn't name Karen directly, but it addressed recent individual actions not affiliated with the HOA, and clarified that our cabin was not part of their association. Translation? They were distancing themselves as fast as they could. Karen had gone rogue, and now the very people she thought she was impressing were throwing her under the bus. We returned to our lake cabin the next weekend, and the change was night and day. People we'd never spoken to before waved from their porches. One couple walked over with a basket of fresh muffins and said, "We're so sorry you had to deal with that woman. We've been hoping someone would finally put her in her place." Apparently, Karen had a long history of complaints, harassing delivery drivers, sending passive-aggressive letters to people whose lawns weren't cut short enough, even calling the HOA over wind chimes. But this court stunt had gone too far, even for her standards. And now the community was fed up. A small group of neighbors began talking about filing a complaint against her with the HOA itself for bringing negative attention to the area. Meanwhile, Karen had gone quiet. She stopped walking her usual patrol routes, stopped waving her clipboard around like a badge, and, for the most part, disappeared. Some neighbors said she was embarrassed. Others said she was reevaluating her priorities. But honestly, we didn't care. We weren't out for revenge. We didn't need to destroy her. We just wanted peace. And ironically, her failed attempt at drama gave us exactly that. There was no more peeking through hedges. No more whispered gossip or dramatic phone calls. Just the sound of the lake water lapping gently against the dock and the laughter of nearby families who finally seemed relaxed again. The best part? My wife, who had been so calm and composed throughout the entire mess, got the recognition she never asked for. People respected her even more now, not just for her position, but for how she handled herself. She didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She didn't throw her badge around. She let the facts speak. She let the law work. And most of all, she let Karen defeat herself. That's what really stung for Karen, I think. She wanted a fight. She wanted to play hero. But instead of finding a villain, she picked a target who calmly showed the world just how ridiculous her crusade was. A week after the court hearing, someone started printing T-shirts as a joke. On the front, it said, "Caution, may legally carry confidence and a sidearm." On the back, it said, "Ask before you sue." We laughed when one of our neighbors dropped a shirt off at the cabin, folded neatly with a note that said, "We're lucky to have y'all here." That meant more to us than anything. And as for Karen? She never apologized, never explained herself, and never admitted she was wrong. But she also never tried anything like that again. And sometimes, silence is the best apology you'll ever get from someone like her. The weeks that followed felt like a different world. The peace we had hoped for when we first bought the lake cabin had finally arrived, not because the trees were greener or the water was clearer, but because Karen had finally been forced into silence. It was like the whole community took a collective breath once she stopped patrolling the neighborhood with her clipboard and binoculars. The tension that used to hang in the air every time someone left a porch light on too late or parked slightly crooked had vanished. And all it took was one courtroom disaster to make it happen. The funny thing is, we never set out to humiliate her. My wife just wanted to enjoy her weekend, take a walk through the woods, and sit by the lake in peace. But Karen couldn't mind her own business. She had to turn everything into a crusade. And when that crusade backfired, the neighborhood finally opened its eyes. We started getting more visitors than ever. Some just wanted to say hi. Others brought small gifts, homemade bread, wildflowers, even extra fishing bait. An elderly couple who had lived 3 cabins down for over 20 years stopped by one evening with 2 cups of sweet tea. "We're sorry you had to deal with that nonsense," the old man said, shaking his head. "She's been like this for years." Glad someone finally stood up to her. My wife smiled and replied, "Sometimes you don't need to fight. You just need to let people see who someone really is." That's the thing about people like Karen. They thrive in the shadows, whispers, gossip, threats that don't quite break the law. But when you shine a light on them, when their behavior is exposed in front of a judge and community, they shrink. Not because they've changed, but because their power, their illusion of control, is shattered. The best part wasn't Karen's silence. It was the shift in the community. People began standing up for one another more often. One neighbor installed a porch swing that Karen had previously complained was too noisy, and no one said a word. Another started bringing their dog on evening walks again, something they'd stopped doing after Karen accused the pup of intimidating the birds. The small acts of freedom returned. My wife, who usually kept to herself, started getting invited to local events, lake cleanups, BBQs, even a little paddle boat race the kids organized. They called her Agent Lake like she was some kind of local legend. It made her laugh, but I could tell it meant something to her. For once, people saw her not just as an officer, but as a neighbor, a protector, and someone who had earned their trust. Karen, meanwhile, seemed to be unraveling quietly. We heard she had resigned from the HOA volunteer board, not officially, but word spread that she'd told a few people she was stepping away to focus on her health. No one was buying it. They knew what had happened. A few even told us that Karen's closest allies had stopped returning her calls after the court hearing. Her illusion of authority was gone. Without the clipboard, the title, and the support of a few scared neighbors, she was just another woman living near the lake. And that, to her, was probably the biggest loss of all. We didn't throw a celebration. We didn't post about it. We didn't rub it in. We just kept living. My wife went back to her normal routine, early morning jogs, reading on the porch, sipping coffee at sunrise. Sometimes I'd catch her staring out at the water, peaceful and quiet, as if the chaos from a few weeks ago had never happened. But every now and then, I'd see that smile on her face, that subtle, knowing smile. The one that said she hadn't forgotten. The one that said she was proud, not because she had won, but because she never let herself stoop to Karen's level. One evening, as we watched the sunset reflect off the lake, she turned to me and said, "You know what the best part of all this was?" I shook my head. Not having to see Karen's face anymore. She laughed. "No. It's knowing that the next time someone like her tries to intimidate someone, she won't have the same power." People saw through it. They saw what lies and fear look like. And they won't fall for it again. That hit me. She was right. Karen might not have changed, but the people around her had. They weren't afraid of her anymore. And that shift, quiet, powerful, permanent, was the real victory. Weeks turned into months, and the lake became our sanctuary again. We planted a small garden, added a new bench near the dock, and even adopted a rescue dog who loved swimming more than walking. Life moved forward. Karen remained distant, her house quiet, her porch empty. Occasionally, we'd see her peek through her blinds when neighbors walked by, but she never came out. Her reign of silent terror was over, replaced by the kind of community she claimed to protect but never truly cared about. The final nail in the coffin came unexpectedly. The HOA released new guidelines and openly encouraged residents to report harassment, not from outsiders, but from within. It was a subtle yet clear statement. They were done enabling behavior like Karen's. One of the board members told me privately, "We let her get away with too much for too long. That's on us." But not anymore. It was satisfying, not because of revenge, but because accountability had finally arrived. Looking back now, it still amazes me how quickly things can turn. One moment, you're being threatened with a lawsuit over something that isn't even illegal. The next, your quiet strength and a few undeniable facts have turned the entire situation on its head. Karen thought she was exposing a threat. But in the end, she exposed herself. And while she retreated into silence, the rest of us stepped into the light, stronger and more united than ever. So if there's a lesson in all this, it's this: never let someone else's ignorance or fear dictate your life. Stand your ground, trust the truth, and when necessary, let the facts speak louder than any accusation. Because sometimes, all it takes to stop a bully is one brave person who knows the law, keeps their calm, and refuses to be intimidated. My wife was that person. And thanks to her, our cabin by the lake finally became the peaceful retreat we always dreamed it would be.